For a very long time, we have been competing with nature and with each other, and we've been looking at short-term instead of long-term goals. And the result is a world at a tipping point. So what if we could change our practices to cooperate with nature and with each other to shift the focus towards creation from destruction and circularity instead of linearity? Are we thinking about climate change in the right way? And do we really need to sacrifice the present to protect the future? Welcome to a new year of SoTalk. My name is Sophie, and I will lead you through these SoTalk seminars of 4 throughout this spring, led by SoCentral. And at SoCentral, we believe that the future is regenerative, and we're excited to learn more about this practice. We believe that solutions can't operate in silos, and to solve the complex challenges ahead of us, we need to work as a part of an interconnected system, whether in nature, in business, or in civil society. We know that a solution in one field can solve several challenges outside that specific field, such as regenerative agriculture, for instance, has a result in climate, but it can also improve social challenges, such as food security, health, and poverty. So how can we start bringing other fields into the equation when solving complex challenges? And who needs to be part of that solution and at the table, or I guess in the Zoom room now? We can only find this by having common platforms where we meet and talk and build trust. And at SoCentral, we create those arenas and build partnerships and collaborations to find solutions that prevent us from working in isolation and build on the interconnected system that we're all part of. Today, we will learn about regeneration and what it is. And the next 3 seminars will look at 3 subtopics: regenerative agriculture, cities, and oceans. We're going to dive into these topics to create a momentum, because we don't think it's enough to leave it as a talk. We want to hear from you, mobilize and discover possibilities within the regenerative movement. Because we believe that when we join forces, voices, and experience, that's when we find the best examples and possibilities within the challenges ahead. So therefore, we're not hosting this series alone, but in collaboration with Sustainability Hub, Sea Change, reNature, the Sustainability Center in Trondheim, Regeneration Mauritius, and Catapult Group. And at SoCentral, we believe in seeking knowledge and putting it through practice, through experimentation, to find new solutions and ways. And we seek knowledge through platforms such as this, gathering experts from all over the world, and other arenas that bridges people and sectors. And by being a part of a group of collaborators, we can bring together new voices. And I hope that you as a participant today both will get some new ideas, learn something and get inspired, but also to see a possibility to continue the conversation and connect to the field. Today you will be introduced to what regeneration is and why it's important. And we have 2 wonderful speakers to do so today with us. Eva Teekens is the Chief Investment Officer at reNature, a Dutch foundation and company with extensive experience in regenerative agriculture and agroforestry in different locations around the world. Their mission is to regenerate 1 million hectares of land worldwide through regenerative agroforestry while ensuring food security for over 10 million farmers and communities by 2030. Eva will introduce the topic of regenerative practice before we look at some specific topics with Alan Moore, who is the founder of Beautiful Business, whose mission is to help businesses discover their own beauty, which is restorative to people and to the planet. Alan Moore will go deeper into the topic of regenerative business, nature, and governance chess, showing us how the regenerative movement is a system rather than a single practice. And of course, like always, there will be room for questions. So if you have any questions to our speakers, please use the chat and write them down as we go along. And of course, if you have any reflections or any ideas you want to share with us, use the chat for that. And at the end of the seminar, we'll bring up your questions. And if you haven't already done so, we're a diverse audience here today, so feel free to use the chat, say who you are, where you're from, and what you work with. And with that being said, I will give the screen to you, Eva.
So first of all, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be invited to these series of talks. I'm by no means an expert. My background is really in impact investment, but there's a reason I moved fields into this one. So I'll give a very short presentation, but before I do so, I want to just present very generically what regeneration means. You probably did some Googling as well. And what I found was the creation of new animal and plant tissue, which is quite generic. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into what that means for reNature. So I won't repeat who reNature is. Sophie did a very good job at that. So at reNature, the problem we're addressing, and often, as you know, pictures speak a million words, is this. This is a really scary image. Certainly not one I want my children to associate with. What I want my children to see and live in is this. And this is really up to us to ensure. And at reNature, we're very much about the positive message. I think we're all too often confronted with doom scenarios and how our world will look like. And we like to think of it positively. What is it that we can do? So today's conventional agriculture is threatening our food security. And it accounts for 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And it's threatening our natural forests. This looks really efficient, and it is, but it's killing for our soils. I like to use this quote from Ernst Götsch. He's also been the mentor of one of the co-founders of reNature. We must work to create areas of permanent inclusion of humans and animals instead of areas of permanent protection from them. And this is where the main difference is between regenerative and restorative. We speak many times of restoration. At reNature, we don't believe in that term because we're not restoring art. An ecosystem is not static, it's in process. It's either in evolution or de-evolution. You can restore it, but it will continue to evolve or decline. Regeneration, on the other hand, takes human systems into account. And that's really the key here. How do the two interact? The traditional approach is to keep humans out, create areas of conservation, let nature be by itself. Regenerative is about realigning human activity with the evolution of the ecosystem. And it has two elements in our eyes: the design, which we offer farmers, but there's a very important one as well that we keep on forgetting, which is the community, the mindsets. How's the community ready to accept these designs and work towards restoration? Then there's another important distinction between sustainability and regeneration. And this helps me, in any case, understand the difference. Sustainability is the bridge and regeneration is the destination. It's beyond the sustainable. And again, the argument is about the static state. So regenerative agriculture is about mimicking nature, and it's a systemic approach. It's not an input-based approach, and that's also what makes it different from organic agriculture, for instance. Organic agriculture is much more mindful of the inputs it uses, but it's still dependent on inputs. So we work with 5 core principles: diversification, keeping soil covered, ensuring food security, and knowledge exchange. And ultimately, we want to show that it's economically viable as well to engage in regenerative practices as opposed to traditional practices. There are several benefits the social benefits, the ecosystem services, and the economic resilience. I won't go into too much detail in the interest of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions along the way if they emerge. So when we talk about regenerative agriculture, we also have 5 core SDGs that we work around. No hunger, good jobs and economic growth, climate action, which is the obvious one, life on land, and last but not least is the partnership for the goals. And I think this is very important. We can't do this alone, but we really look at the full value chain, at corporates. What are they doing? Where are they sourcing from? With the farmers, what are the challenges they are facing? So what we want to do is go from this to this. And our mission is to reNature. So I hope that was clear, at least from our end, how we see regenerative agriculture in a more specific context. But it also helps explaining what regeneration is, which is really the topic of today's discussion.
And before going into the questions, we're just going to jump ahead to our second speaker, Alan Moore. And then remember, if you have any questions, write them in the chat and we'll bring it up after Alan Moore's presentation.
Well, good morning, everybody. And thank you, Sophie and Thomas and everybody else for inviting me to speak today. My talk is based on 2 books that I've written, which has kind of taken up probably the best part of the last 10 years of my life. A new book which I'm about to publish, which I've been working on, which is Do Build. I just want to sort of touch on this idea about the sort of part of the title of what does the world need? Because I think it's one of the most pressing questions of our time. Because I think this question encompasses a number of other questions, which is, why are we here? For what reason do we exist? What values create the foundation of what matters most? What kind of world are we trying to create? We must transform our mindset, but to what end? And it's because of that, I think that we need to, for me anyway, turn to this idea of beauty. But where do we start with beauty? It can be seen a rather sort of strange word to be using, perhaps in many ways. So this is where I think we need to start. And what I'd like you to do is either to shut your eyes or just to imagine. But I want you to imagine that you're in a spaceship. And in that spaceship, there's a guy called Edgar Mitchell. He's an astronaut. And he's asking you to look out of the window. And out of the window, you can see the sun, the earth, and the moon hanging in the vast and endless void. And Edgar says to you, when I first saw that for the very first time, I was overcome by an incredible sense of profound love and beauty. And it was transcendental. And what I realized at that moment is that the molecules in my body, the molecules in this spaceship, the molecules in my spacesuit were all forged in an ancient star. We are all stardust. And of course, it kind of leads me on to another gentleman called Frank Vilcek. And Frank Vilcek was a Nobel Prize winning scientist who wrote a book called The Most Beautiful Question. And the most beautiful question is the world a work of art? And he talks about the deep structural design of our cosmos and our nature, where Einstein's theory of relativity or Paul Dirac's theory about how subatomic particles interact with each other over a vast space are all part of the deep design of what makes our world work. So for me, I think that beauty gets us out of surfaces and into the very foundations of things. In many respects, beauty is our homecoming. And of course, in many ways, we've not allowed to use the word beauty. I like to use the term beautiful business, but it makes people feel uncomfortable because in fact, reality is we don't think about beauty in many respects, but we intuit it, and it is a fundamental part of who we are. And following on from what Eva was talking about, in fact, I would say that nature is probably the best designer that we have. And her purpose is to support the needs of all life. Nature doesn't waste a single atom. And also, nature has a very long horizon line. As the artist Anselm Kiefer said to me once, when God made time, he made a lot of it. So if we want to be around for a bit longer than we have been already, then I think we really start to be looking at nature's design model. And I would say that kind of gets us to think about beauty in form, beauty as process, and beauty as an ecosystem. And that kind of really gets me onto this idea about regeneration. The root of beauty for me is regeneration. And I think that now is the moment, the opportunity that business can do good, that we can remake our world, and we can seek the good and manifest it in all that we create. And I think if we are going to build a future worth living in, we must try to achieve the equilibrium between ecology, our economy, and our communities. And we need a reimagining of the very purpose of business and the role that it plays in regenerating our economy, our environment, and our civilization. And I think back to this point about need, what does the world need? That is what the world needs from business. And I think that is what business needs to give the world. And for me also, I think beauty speaks a very different language. This point about sustainability, I think, is a very important one that Eva raised. When I wrote my first book, Why Beauty is Key to Everything, I was sitting in the offices of a very large law firm with a big lawyer who specialized in CSR, corporate social responsibility. And he sat there with his arms folded and he said to me, so Alan, tell me, what can the word beauty give the world of sustainability? And I looked at him and I said, well, it's very simple. I said, I'm a musician and I play a guitar and I can play what is called a sustaining note. But my friend, I can't hold that note forever. I can't sustain it forever. And I feel that the world of sustainability makes me feel like I'm hanging on by my fingernails. There's also a moral paradigm to this as well. And actually, when we're telling people that they can't do stuff and they've got to stop stuff, if people are actually in the state of belief that climate change does not exist, or there are things they shouldn't do, they aren't going to be listening to what you say. Whereas beauty for me is the lifeblood and the oxygen of our world. It talks about wonder and it talks about joy and it talks about wholesomeness and a world that is whole and that we are part of it. And to me, there's a deeper understanding and it's a bigger door and it's more invitational than if we talk about the world from the perspective of sustainability. And we have got to really be able to tell that story and persuade all of humanity that they want to come on that journey with us. We can describe a world that is better than the one that we currently have. And that is extremely important. So in Do Build, in the first part of the book, I talk about this idea of the foundations. If we're going to think about businesses of the future and how they're really going to serve us well, we've really got to think about what that means. So I've touched on this idea of beauty. There's something else about beauty to me, which I think is very important as a human value, which is all to do with values and ethics. There was a philosopher called Iris Murdoch who in the 60s wrote a book called The Sovereignty of Good. And she said, the good should not be the name of an esoteric object, but should be the tool of every rational man. It is our job, our responsibility to bring the good into the world. I've talked about nature, and obviously Eva has talked about nature, the idea of the re-enchantment, the reconnection, the understanding that we are absolutely fundamentally part of this incredible ecosystem is important. Biomimicry, the study of how nature works, and to be inspired by it and to learn from it, because it's so important if we're going to think about those things. And of course, the whole conversation about regeneration, the whole conversation about circular economy is all to do really with understanding that we have to think fundamentally about what it is we make, how we make it, and what we waste. 4 is design. I would say that I'm a designer. I've always been a designer of many different things. And just to make the point very simply here, that Everything man-made in this world is designed. It doesn't matter what it is. There's a point, it doesn't exist. We have to imagine it, and we have to imagine how to put those things together. We have to think about how design plays a fundamental role in the regenerating of our world. The fifth is values and metrics, which I'm going to get to very shortly. And the sixth one is governance. What are the kind of forms of organizational structure that we really need to be addressing? For example, B Corps as one example of a way where, as businesses, we start to become far more accountable to ourselves and to the planet and our economies in a very different type of way. This is a chart that I put together. It's a very simple one, but we talk about the difference between an extractive economy and a regenerative economy. With a regenerative economy, we have to really talk about what is it we are contributing to the world? How do we contribute back to nature? How do we contribute back to communities? There should be a form of legacy making, which is actually through the practice and the processes of the businesses that we create and we're running. We've got to think about societal interest. We've got to think about social impact. We have to move from this idea that growth for growth's sake at 25% every year is the way we grow, because if we were designed to grow exponentially, human beings would be over 250 feet tall and some. We have to look at the way that nature works, and it is fully circular. You know, back to that point that nature doesn't waste a single atom. And actually, there's already a lot of evidence that businesses that are really working in a circular fashion are in fact a lot more effective and a lot more efficient than those that actually are working on the old industrial model. And we'll see this shift quite significantly over the next few years. We have to move from short term to long term. And there's a story I'm going to tell about a particular company, which I think sort of puts that into perspective. But we can't be thinking in quarters. I mean, even for some businesses, 5 years is the longest way out that they will think. But actually, we've got to be thinking 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. What is the way that we need to plan? So we create succession in a very different type of way. We've got to think about how we create and nurture resourceful humans. Actually, if we want businesses to be thriving and really successful and to working at their very best, it's not about crushing the humans that they employ or people within their supply chain, but to ensure that everyone is actually working at their full and optimum potential. We've got to move from departments to communities. I think for leaders, we have to become great storytellers. We have to be able to inspire and motivate people and for them to yearn for that more beautiful world that I was describing. And we have to think about cultures. How do we make those rich, like the soil, in a way that actually allows all life to thrive? So this idea, for example, of how we tell a story, let's reframe it. Let's say climate change is an opportunity. If we consider the climate crisis, we're all doomed. How do you feel? Excited, motivated, ready to give your all to the task ahead? Or can you think about climate change as an opportunity, offering the means to rethink, redesign, and remake our world? Now, some might describe that as utopian, but we don't get to create or discover anything without belief and optimism, even under the most perilous conditions. And so now I want to introduce you to just one example of a business which I think is pioneering, innovative, and regenerative. But just before I get to them, this is a gentleman called Dieter Rams. Dieter, very, very famous industrial designer. And in fact, without Dieter, there would be no Johnny Ive, who would have designed the Apple iPod. Dieter is actually sitting on and surrounded by all the things that he designed in his life as an industrial designer. I think that he said something very, very important, because all of that work that you've got in front of you that you're looking at, in a sense, was sort of in the 50s, this idea that design could democratize and make people's lives better. But Dieter said, now the time for thoughtless design, for thoughtless consumption is over. And I think that's where this idea of design for me is so important, coupled with all sorts of other things. So I'm going to tell you very quickly a story about an organization called Climeworks. This is a geothermal heating plant in Iceland. and it's where some of Climeworks' innovative technology is being used. But I just want to go back a bit and start the story in Chamonix. The founders of Climeworks, Jan Würzbacher and Christoph Gebaut, were keen skiers, and every year they would go to Chamonix to ski. But every year that they would go, the ladder they had to climb up to get to the lifts that would take them up the mountain to ski down had to be increased by 2 meters. And they realized that climate change was a very real and pressing problem. They were both based at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And what they decided is that they wanted to keep on skiing. They wanted to enjoy the life they had. But the way that they were going to do that was to dedicate themselves to taking 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide out of the air, which is what we need to be removed every year and stored. Now, when they first started working on this technology, which looks like this, everyone said it couldn't be done. They couldn't invent a machine that could take air in, capture CO2 and pump out clean air, but they did. And then they were told that actually their business model would never work. There'd never be a market and a business for this type of thing. And they were proved wrong, the disbelievers. And when I was in conversation with Jan, what he was saying to me is that I believe a big problem in the financing of regenerative projects is the time horizon. The typical venture capital or even private equity model, having a fund which you fill up, you invest, and after 5 to 7 to 10 years, you have to repay the fund. I believe a typical venture fund is not the best partner to scale businesses focused on regeneration and industrial innovation. So what these guys do with this technology is that they can actually now take that pure CO2, and in Iceland, they store that 1,000 meters underground. Every year, they can scale up exponentially the efficiency of these machines. And what is interesting is that they don't make their money out of selling their machines, but they sell a service where people, companies all over the world can subscribe to this carbon capture. And what Jan said, and it's back to this thing about, it's not about stopping doing something. He said, people come to us and they say, what can we do? How can we contribute? How can we be part of this ecosystem? And they say, even when you can only contribute €7 a month, you can actually be doing something about contributing to the take back of the carbon dioxide in the world. So just some notes on these guys. Be unreasonable. Jan and Christoph were both unreasonable people and drove their innovation to do something truly beautiful, in my view. The story that they tell is really talking to the hearts and minds, and I think that's very important. I think supply chains can be beautiful, and that to change everything, you need everyone to be part of that buy-in, and that's absolutely critical. I believe that, as I say here, innovation should only be applauded if it makes people's lives better, restoring equilibrium between the economy, our ecology, and our societies. And at the end of the book, I've got 13 design questions that I think we need to ask if actually we're going to bring the good and bring regenerative businesses into this world. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm just going to touch on them very quickly. And the first one is, does it matter? Now, obviously, the word purpose is used a lot these days, but I would say Donald Trump had purpose. It's just not the sort of purpose we needed in this world. Whereas I think we can reframe it and we say, does it matter? Does it matter to the world? Does it matter to me? Does it matter to my community? Does it matter to my team? What is the mattering? If we want to be around for eternity, as I said, or a bit longer, I think we really have to investigate that question. The second one is, how is it transformative? I think Climeworks demonstrates a really good example of a business that is truly transformative and has found actually a very good business model to be part of that regenerative economy and ecology. How is it regenerative? It's not about how is it sustainable, it is how is it regenerative? How is it going to regenerate the world? How is it useful? back to sort of Dieter Rams, but I think that whole idea about design and utility is extremely important, and the usefulness of something is very clearly connected to me to that whole idea about what does the world need. And lastly, how will we create legacy? For too long, and this has been one of the problems, is businesses are only in business to make money. They're not there to create legacy and to pass things down to future generations. And we really have to fundamentally change our mindset. What I do believe is that there are a lot of people around the world, a lot of individuals, a lot of businesses, which are very focused, I think, in having this dialogue about how we create legacy. And that is why beauty is the ultimate metric. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. That's also a very inspirational talk. And I really enjoy the way you reframe the narrative. So it doesn't have to be everyone giving up everything to solve the climate challenge. We can actually create something in the way. So before we go on, I see there's come up a lot of questions from the audience, but I have a few questions for both you, Alan and Eva. So based on both of your presentations, we've seen all of these great possibilities, and there's a lot of positivity in your talks. But are there any main critiques, and what would be the main challenges in going forward with the regenerative, both the short-term challenges, but also the long-term? Eva, do you want to start, and then we'll move on to Alan?
So the main challenges we see, at least in the work we do, is technology. So the need to create new machinery and tools to manage the farm and to harvest, for instance. Willingness of corporates and bankers to be encouraged enough to change dramatically their supply chain. Another one would be making a strategy that fits ground reality. That one's very important for us because we're quite centralized at the moment, but we heavily rely on local experts that understand cultural differences, community, etc. Lack of knowledge, I think it's a big one. I think even amongst farmers, there's a lack of knowledge on regenerative practices. Last but not least, the fear of change. So you're stuck in a system, and then you have the short-term versus the long-term profit thinking. Yeah, I think those are, at least for us, what we encounter the main challenges.
Good points. And I think I want to draw on a lot of these points, but before I do that, Alan, do you have anything to add?
I would agree with all of what Eva has said. Education, absolutely. I think being able to frame things, as I said, for me, it's you need to be lovingly disruptive to the people that you want to convince that they need to change their minds. And that's where I think the craft of storytelling is so important, and to frame it actually that this is going to be so much better than what we currently got. I mean, that said, and I think let's just go back to what Jan, the CEO of, talks about. He says, the battles we are facing are stories about belief. So we don't tell the story in a way that you need to stop doing things. Every story we are telling is around we can do something, we can act. And I think that that is really important to tell that story. He also goes on to say, and his belief, and it's also mine, that I think we're at a tipping point here, actually. I think there's a younger generation. I mean, I'm 56, so I'm an older soul these days, but that desperately want a fundamental change in the world that they want. I think that whole idea about contribution is very much part of that. Getting people to feel that they can make a contribution, no matter how small it is. I think it's key. And also to understand that one size doesn't fit all, in the same way that nature works. It's like, so in the new book, I put a list of 49 businesses together, which I believe to be beautiful. One is actually from a one-man band who make beautiful objects that you bring into the home, right up to a country, which is New Zealand, because I say they're still a business. And what makes them fantastic is that they're looking at their long-term strategy in terms of well-being as part of their fundamental core promise. So I think being able to see that there's this kind of a range of ways in which we can all be part of this, and people to see that is absolutely key. Yeah, and keep the story simple. You know, don't make it complicated for people. Is my view.
I think this is also the basis of Common Lands for Returns framework. And they've included a return. We spoke today of 3 returns, the economic return, environmental return, and social return. And they come with the 4th dimension, and that's the inspiration return. And I think that's very much linked to what Alan is saying, is that if we don't have that optimism, then it's very difficult. And one of the things that they suggest regenerative agriculture, just regeneration in general, can bring to people is that return on inspiration, which is very important to keep us going.
Yeah, I mean, we operate on hope and the idea that things can be better, and I think that's absolutely key. That's the way you persuade the non-believers to come on your side. To be angry with people if you don't agree with them. I mean, I could say I'm angry. You know, I was angry, you know, a long time ago about what I saw going on in the world of business. But what I learned is it doesn't help at all to be angry. You know, you've got to hold out your arms, you know, with great compassion and great love for your fellow man, even when you don't agree with them. And it's actually on your shoulders to find a way to persuade them to see the world through your eyes.
I think these are really excellent points. And going forward with the storytelling aspect, because a lot of people don't really understand what regeneration and regenerative practices are. So how could we, in just a few keywords, kind of talk about regeneration in a way that explains it and brings people in and makes people want to change their models? Do you have any ideas on that?
Well, I think it depends who you're talking to, right? And I think that's also about storytelling, is to adapt your story to your audience. If you talk to farmers, there's an inevitable point that you need to touch upon, which is financial sustainability, economic viability. It's very easy to go to smallholder farmers in Africa and come with yet another buzzword. I saw one of the participants mentioning it. And then, you know, expecting them to start doing something else. So I think, at least with regenerative agriculture, if you're talking to farmers, this is about the long-term profitability of your land. How can you keep your soil healthy? How can you increase your revenue streams by diversifying? So these are just a few of them, but also hunger. If you have more crops on your land, you can also feed yourself. You're not just dependent on the cash crops that you take to market, and you're not able to feed your own family, which is, right, it's counterintuitive. But also women empowerment, which was very difficult for me to grasp when I learned about regenerative agriculture. And but it's there as well, right? If you have wood in your backyard and water retention, by having a much richer system, then you don't need to walk for hours to fetch water or fetch firewood. And you can use those hours in other activities. So it's very much who you're talking to. If you're talking to an investor, which is what I do most, trying to get funding for this, you also have that economic viability. And it's a shame that we always have to address that, but it's important because we're not there yet in terms of understanding that this is about the long term. This is about investments we do today and we reap the benefits later on. So with investors, that's also very much the rhetoric, but it's also very much, you know, there is so much pressure at the moment, and rightfully so, for investors to start looking at their portfolios and the environmental impact of their portfolios. And a lot of them are struggling. They don't know where to invest or what to invest, and how can they invest whilst not jeopardizing the quality and the return of their portfolio. So again, it depends very much who you talk to. Consumers, obviously, you can maybe drop the economic viability and talk more about inspiration, you know, what you want your children. to live in, what kind of world. We need to feed more people, but how can we do that in a sustainable way? So it really depends who you're talking to.
I think there's some very interesting evidence coming out, and also there's a shift I see. For example, the Financial Times is writing very differently about the nature of our economy now. And I would recommend people to read the Financial Times because I think it really comes without a bias. It's very, very serious reporting. Even if you only read it on a Saturday, it really shows you that there's a shift going on. The other thing I'd point to is the recent Ellen MacArthur Foundation report that makes the point that investment in ESGs are outperforming the industry benchmarks by 5.2%. So, you know, as I said in the beginning, it's like if you really look at the design model of the natural world, it's like nothing gets wasted, and actually that is really, really efficient. Whereas we run businesses which are incredibly inefficient by the way that it extracts and the way it kind of deals with all of those things. And so there is something going on, and I think that there is an understanding. I mean, Larry Fink, as you know, is the chairman of BlackRock. He writes every year a letter to all the CEOs that they're engaged with. 2 years ago, it was purpose. This year, it was about ESGs, and it was about understanding that we can't carry on as we are if we want to be around for a bit longer. And of course, there will be, as there always is, when you get great transformation, a lot of resistance from those that want to give up their power. You know, there will be certain businesses, I think, that over the next 5 to 10 years, which won't be allowed to operate anymore. And Mark Carney, who was the head of the Bank of England, just before he left, he said, businesses that continue to invest in fossil fuels will find their assets valueless in the next few years. And so I think that, you know, at all levels, there is actually this debate going on. But as we know, with any great transition, it's always a struggle. It's not easy, and there will be great resistance to do that. And we just have to find any and every means that we've got to help people to understand that actually there is a far better way that we can be in business.
Once we've created that understanding and we're starting that transformation, how can we then prevent that regeneration becomes just another buzzword?
I'm rather hoping that it won't be. I'm absolutely convicted. I mean, I spent a lot of time, a lot of my life really thinking about what it is I want to be putting my time and energy into. And so there's a lot of questioning that goes on, but I'm convicted about this. I'm convicted about the story around beauty. I'm convicted around the idea that businesses need to be beautiful. And I think that when people start to see that actually their lives are better by living in a world that is regenerative, I think it won't be a buzzword at all. I mean, this debate in many respects has been a long time coming. And I think it really is now coming to the fore in terms of, I mean, we've got over 100 people on this call engaged in this topic. And I think that sort of demonstrates the desire to be that change and to live it. I think that's what I see.
Eva, do you have anything to add to that point about buzzwords?
No, I agree, and it is a question that some investors ask me as well quite often. The thing is, it's not as much as it's. I don't see it as a buzzword, because once you learn about it, you realize it's not a buzzword. It's been around for centuries. It's just we started doing things differently because we needed scalability. We needed to match population growth, and now we've come to a point where we realize it's not sustainable anymore, so we need to take a step back. It's not new, it's not innovative in that sense, but so that's at least my standard answer. I don't think it's a buzzword in that sense, and that's why I also very much highlighted, okay, what's the difference with organic farming, because that did become a buzzword, but also out of necessity, right? And now this is the necessity, and until we've addressed this need, well, I welcome any other buzzwords that address the needs. and come up with a solution.
Yeah, I just want to stress that I think it's inevitable once there's something, a topic that comes up, that it becomes a buzzword, but it's important, and I want to emphasize the importance of bringing those examples to the table so that we can always show to something concrete.
But that's, yeah, but I mean, I think that's where, well, for me, it's like when I wrote the first book and I wrote about beauty, and it came from a very deep period of reflection about where I wanted to put my energy and my efforts. But and in a sense, I wrote that book to write myself home. That's the way that I describe it. When at a time I was quite lost, let's put it that way. But what has amazed me in the journey over the last 5 years is how that story really resonates with people, and there's a yearning for it, because in a way it's easy to dismiss, but when people really understand that you're really talking about beauty seriously, they understand that it, as I said, it affects every element of their lives, and it's a soulful yearning. It's a physical yearning. It's it deals with so many aspects of the human condition and how we are in the world and how we are to each other. And I think that, to me, is why it's not buzzy at all. There will be some people, and there already have been some, that have gone, yeah, I'll take that, and they'll go and do their thing. But it's just not at the kind of, the deep level that, to me, is really important. And so I'm very keen to really work on that. Not as so the book, in a sense, is the tip of the iceberg for me. There's actually a movement that I'm very keen to engage with. And that conversation is already going on with me, with some very interesting and serious people in the UK, but who have a big international footprint, which they see this as key in bringing people with them. Lastly, I mean, Jan Vilcek, again, the guy from Kleinworks, said to me, he thinks in the next 5 years there will not be a single CEO of a large corporate that will be able to get away with not having a climate target, a carbon target, and a larger sustainability target. And on top of that, I think that there will be continuing legislation. I mean, if you think about it, when smoking was banned, I mean, I don't know if, whether you can remember that, but I can remember sitting in pubs, full of smoke. And when they said they were going to ban smoking, everyone said, well, no one would go to the pub anymore. And that just simply wasn't the case. We changed. And so there will be legislation that will also be coming in. And as I say, there will be a certain point where, they'll be saying you can't make NDF anymore because it is not a circular business. It's a extractive business. It's a destructive business. It's going into landfill. And all of these things, I think, will come together to kind of force a different way of businesses being in the world. And we just need to encourage that. So you could be writing to your MP and you could ask them, what are you doing locally to actually ensure that a regenerative economy is on the table? That's another way that you can apply pressure to those that you are thinking hard about this.
Yeah, and you touched a little bit on it now, but what kind of arguments can be used to get those businesses and the government involved in regenerative practices and to create that shift?
Well, from what I see, and that's quite interesting as well, reNature has a very big pipeline at the moment of projects, and these projects approach us from 3 sides. They approach us from the farmers that want to transition, but also a lot of corporates. And to be honest, we've now been in operation for almost 2.5 years. We're not doing any active acquisition. People are coming to us. Nespresso is coming to us. Timberland is coming to us. Lush is coming to us. So obviously, I'm in it. So I see firsthand what's going on also with corporates. I also see in the chat there's a lot of question about policy, but honestly, I believe this is coming from the corporates and the corporations. There's enough pressure there, and there's also enough going on in the public sector that is facilitating this shift. A lot of these corporates realize that if they want to remain leaders, not only in coffee for an espresso. I was watching yesterday TV, and I saw George Clooney, but instead of the consumer parts, you know, a sexy guy having a coffee, all the ladies going around him, he was actually on the land with the coffee plants. And Nespresso was claiming that by 2023, they wanted to be CO2 neutral. That's a huge shift. And this is Nespresso we're talking about. So I think it's happening already. Of course, we wanted to go faster. And that's also at reNature, what we try to do is we're not only helping the transition, but we started reNature with a brand. We created awareness. That was our main goal at the beginning, was sharing these stories. And I truly believe that we are getting there slowly but surely, and there will be a tipping point. And if I see Nespressos, if I see big fashion houses as well, luxury fashion houses approaching us for this shift, it gives me a lot of hope. And I believe that we are on the right path.
What kind of actors are we reliant on to make this shift succeed? You touched a little bit on it, Eva, but do you have any ideas of who needs to be involved to make this change? And how?
Everyone. Everyone, I feel. Obviously, some people have more influence than others. So if we talk about big corporates, you know, or if we talk about fashion houses, governments as well. You see the city of Amsterdam last year, they decided to adopt the donut economics model. So it's coming there, but awareness is key. It's the first step, but you need everyone to be involved.
I agree with that. I mean, we're all accountable. We're all responsible for all of those things. And I think that, well, what I've tried to do through the work that I've done is to really demonstrate that that is absolutely doable. Telling the story about Climeworks is very important because it shows you there's a very different way of thinking about energy and carbon reduction and the way that we can contribute. You know, I've also talked about Veya in the book, and again, you know, two guys that have fundamental issues around the business of fashion. I mean, the reason why they created Veya was actually they knew that for their generation, what everyone wore on their feet was sneakers, and that if you were able to build and design and create, you know, a sneaker in a way that is not traditionally made, that these then tells a story about, you know, where all the materials come from. I mean, they talk about, Sebastian Kopp, you know, talks about, you know, human justice, ecological justice, and they've thought through everything that they do, which is for me like the mattering. You know, how much are we going to pay our farmers? Where do we get our materials from? And they can do all of that stuff and they can be successful. And ultimately, I think that those that choose to stay in the old paradigm of working will find themselves drowned out eventually by people that want something very different. And again, I mean, I was in a conversation with someone earlier this week about, you know, what was going on and that it was all still kind of greenwashing and all the rest of it. I said, look, you know, 20 years ago, I didn't ask where my clothes came from. I didn't ask who made them. I wasn't interested in the supply chain of that stuff. But now I do ask those questions. And I think a lot of other people are asking questions about the nature of those things. And so we do see a really big shift.
And talking about that shift, Marie in the chat has asked a question that she has observed a growing gap between traditional conventional farmers who are convinced that their mission and purpose is to produce as much as possible dairy and meat for people who don't necessarily want to change. That might be encouraged by populist or just politicians. And on the other hand, there's small or organic and vegetable farmers or urban people who want the other thing. So there's and who have a growing gap or have a growing concern about the climate change and the limits of the earth. So how could we bridge that growing gap between those two groups?
That's to understand your question. So you have the the big producers of say, dairy and cattle and the organic producers. There was also, just to link it maybe to a question earlier in the chat about, regenerative practices are for smallholder farmers. How can we do regenerative practices at scale? That's one of the misconceptions. Regenerative agriculture can be done at scale. And of course, there's this challenge of technology on how to harvest at scale and not lose money, but it is definitely possible. Speaking from Holland, what I've seen here, and we've talked a lot with the government, we've talked a lot also to Friesland Campina, for instance. These big producers are feeling it as well. They understand that the demand is still there for a lot of dairy, but they also understand that the way they're currently milking cows or mass production is not sustainable. So they're looking for solutions there as well. And this is, of course, something, if you diversify from milk producing, you might be thinking, okay, I'm not meeting demand. But the thing is, if everyone diversifies and everyone has also cows on their land, for instance, to produce milk, you can bring that supply to the same level. It's just, instead of one farmer doing only corn and another farm doing only milk, this farm does half corn, half milk. This farm does half corn, half milk. You're benefiting the land. You're not losing out in terms of revenues. But of course, this shift takes an investment, and the investment is not to be borne by the farmer. It needs to be borne by banks, by financial institutes. And that's where often the problem arises. If you think of subsidies, for instance, farmers here in Holland and probably in all of Europe are highly dependent on subsidies to be profitable. And that's just bizarre to me, because they are the ones who feed us. Why do they need subsidies to be profitable? So there's also a lot of discussion there with governments on creating, for instance, a regenerative subsidy that helps the farmers do the transition. But in the long run, they should not be dependent on subsidies to have to be profitable. So you need to do something about prices. If you eat minced meat, for instance, the price is incredibly low. So obviously there's a big shift at government level, but it is coming. People are talking about it, and that's what's important.
I think it's a really important point that Eva makes, and I mean, I would say for many years I've really thought about this in terms of the whole ecosystem of food production. I think about here in England anyway, but I think it's a similar model where supermarkets say they're serving the customer by giving them the cheapest price that they can, but of course ultimately when that price becomes a false one, and that sits on the shoulders of the farmer, whoever it is, that's not a fair price. That's not a real price at all, and that's been a big issue for me, and that's just continued. Animal welfare is something else that I feel very passionately about. It's a difficult and moral question in many respects, but I think that ultimately there will come a conversation, which is, we have to think very carefully about how we are, nurturing. I mean, if you think about it, if they're even through the great work that the UN has done with sustainability goals and the SDGs, and ultimately that has created pressure for people to think and work differently about that. What would be the equivalent of the regenerative kind of models or whatever and policies? Anyway, so I think the supermarkets, in a sense, they're drive for profits, but they're making the money, but the pressure is then put on the farmers, as Eva was saying, and that goes all around the world. Monsanto, I don't have their posters on my wall because of their practices that they ensure. But we have to show and demonstrate that we've got to think very differently about our food systems, and that we have to pay a fair and reasonable price to enable those people to live a decent life. I mean, one of the businesses that I talk about in Do Build is Falcon Coffees. They're really working at trying to change the way that coffee is grown and traded and all the rest of it. Coffee is a commodity, ergo the people that grow the coffee are a commodity. you know, and they're all part of the same ecosystem, you know, and Falcon are working really hard to kind of try to change that, which again, I think is a great example of that type of debate. It just takes longer than we will ever anticipate, but that's okay. We just have to keep on at it.
And it brings us also back to the policy issues that's been raised a lot in the chat. And Jacqueline also brings up that large corporate entities express their willingness to change due to consumer pressure, but how do they accompany the large growers who are also their suppliers to produce differently? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think it's about a real commitment to that change. I mean, one of the great examples that has been written about, I mean, it's almost like the world's best kept secret, but Interface, which is a large carpet tile manufacturer, you know, very simply, you know, it was started, I don't know, 30 odd years ago, maybe even longer, by a guy called Ray Anderson. And they were a very nasty extractive business. They took lots of raw materials, they mixed it with lots of kind of nasty chemicals. They laid it on floors all around the world. And when it was done, it was scraped up and put into landfill. It wasn't good. And actually, it was reading Paul Hawkins' book, I think, The Ecology of Commerce, that Ray had this sort of transformative, well, epiphany almost. And he said, I am going to transform this business to be fully sustainable by 2020. And he goes to his institutional shareholders and he says, this is what I'm going to do. And they say, oh, Ray, that's great. But how much more money is it going to make us? But, you know, in a sense, I mean, those field notes on transformation that I shared, I talked about Climeworks, but will be equally relevant to Interface, which is you've got to take everybody with you. And what's interesting about Interface now is that they did become a sustainable business, but now they've moved the mountain and they said, we want to be a fully regenerative business by 2025 or 2030. And actually they completely re-engineered their entire supply chain. They've rethought the business models that make that work, but they've made the business better as a consequence of that. In a sense, therefore, and I've spent quite a bit of time talking to people at Interface, their work is deeply meaningful for them because they feel that they're contributing again back to the world. And I think that that's where, for me, the design questions that I've put together, really thinking about this quite deeply, is a form of you know, provocation, but it lays a pathway and a journey for people to really investigate and think about how it is they're going to transform. And that is absolutely essential to what they're doing. And equally, at the same time, you can be showing them examples of a whole range of different businesses. And the reason why I wrote about Interface in this book is because people would say, oh, yeah, well, you know, Climeworks, you know, they're a startup, they had no problems, you know, they build it from scratch, blah, blah, blah. And I'm saying, right, okay, so here's a company that's a super tanker, and they turned that super tanker around and they totally transformed it. It is possible. Some people then will say, yeah, but isn't that really hard? And I say, well, I don't really care, but we're doing the right thing, you know, and that's also important. But at least the work that we're doing is worthwhile and actually focused in the right direction. And yes, I mean, back to the point I said earlier, policy, ask your MP, ask people that are working on those things, what are you doing about regeneration? Ask your supermarket, all of those sorts of things, or business that you're operating in, and call them out and make them think about it.
Katerina in the chat has a question for you, Alan. You mentioned nature, beauty, and design as essential for reimagining a regenerative economy and a society. And she's wondering if you've ever thought about how spirituality or spiritual values supports this cause as well, looking into indigenous traditions of living in balance with nature. There's often a strong spiritual aspect, acknowledging that we all come from one source or that we're all one. Yeah. So can we inspire and create stories needed to move regenerative practices?
I completely agree. So, I mean, obviously, as you know, one has to be careful in approaching this particular topic. But so I would use the word soulful, but spiritual, yes. I mean, I think that each and every one of us is deeply spiritual. And I think one of the things that has caused great harm to us all as a humanity, in a large part, is that as we've fallen away from the major religions, you know, for a whole variety of different reasons, our spiritual appetite is not being fed. Now, I say I go for a walk every day. I walk for 2 hours every day out in the countryside, right? That feeds me spiritually. You know, Buddhism is the thing. I'm not a practicing Buddhist, but, you know, Buddhism was the means by which I got to think very differently about my interior landscape. And what I realized was many years ago that I had ignored it for a large part of my life. And as a consequence of that, I was impoverished. And so for me, I think that there is an absolutely natural element of this idea about nature and beauty, which is a fundamental reconnecting to our spirituality or our soulfulness. In a sense, again, I think that the framing of that within beauty is a universal language that principally people can understand. Now, I did give you an example of that, which was a few years ago. I was asked to go and give a talk in England. It was a Sunday morning. It was at 11 o'clock. And I thought, it was a free event. And I thought, who's going to turn up on a Sunday morning at 11 o'clock for a talk about beauty? But anyway, there was about 40, 50 people in the room. And I gave a story about why and how it is I started on this journey around beauty. So I shared my vulnerability, let's just say that, with this audience. Now, two profound things happened. One was that a lot of people came up to me afterwards and said, thank you for sharing your vulnerability, because actually it was the bridge by which you took us across, for us to really be open to the story that you were telling. And when I got home, there was an email from a lady who hadn't spoken to me. And she said, I came to your talk today with my struggling and ragged step family. And I listened to what you had to say, and you convinced me that the fight for beauty was worthwhile, and you'd filled my heart with optimism. And I thought that was extraordinary. And it, you know, it still kind of makes me feel quite amazed when I tell that story. So slightly long answer, but absolutely this reconnecting to our soulful and spiritual selves, whichever way we wish to express it, is absolutely fundamental. And that to me is why beauty speaks a different language to the language of sustainability, because it's framing a much more complex and multidimensional world that we can thrive in. Whereas if we ignore it, then, you know, it diminishes our experience of those things.
Exactly. And you've already touched on it, but Thea in the chat also asks how you would suggest that we invite in arts and humanities to generate those new stories and cosmologies that we need to create and the change that the world needs.
So I have a saying, which is artists are the cultural astronauts of our world. They are the ones that ask all sorts of very interesting questions, which 30 years out look like very strange things. But if you really want to know what the world is going to look like, you go and talk to an artist. They play a really important role. I mean, look at Olafur Eliasson, for example, with his weather project that he did at Tate Modern, you know, with the great big sun that completely just, you know, that huge turbine hall was just completely drenched in this just red glowing light. And I think it's the biggest recorded visitor numbers ever. I think that, you know, it did a great job in reconnecting people, you know, to thinking about the world in a different way. And I think absolutely artists, writers. I mean, the other person that I always talk about is Robin Wall Kimmerer. So if you've never read Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, I highly recommend it, because if you're not in love with the natural world already, by the time you've read Robin's book, you will want to hold it and love it and protect it and all the rest of it. She's a Native American. She's very angry about what the white man did to her race. And she's very clear about that. But she presents it in a very interesting way. But there's two other things that are really important. One is she's a botanist, she's a scientist. But because of her Native American heritage, she has a very different relationship with nature, which is this deep connected relationship, and this whole idea about seeing it as a gift. So that to me is extremely important. I think her writing, along with Olaf Eliasson's, and there will be all sorts of other artists around the world, which are just really raising that debate and that consciousness even of that we need to think very differently about our role on this planet. So very, very important. We need all the artists we can get.
Absolutely. And if you're sitting in the audience now wanting to write down that book, we'll send you the name in a summary email afterwards. So don't worry. And Olga is also asking in the chat how the ag tech industry is responding to this shift.
I think ag tech is incredibly important in this shift, and for one of the challenges I mentioned was technology. So we really rely on ag tech. You rely on ag tech for the harvesting part, but we also rely heavily on ag tech for the measuring part. And that's something we haven't touched upon yet, because one thing is to advocate for regenerative agriculture, another thing is to measure the benefits of regenerative agriculture, which is very important for everyone to see the results. So there's a lot of work being done already with satellite imagery, for instance. But satellite imagery is not very accurate. Often it needs to be validated by underground technology, measuring the soil or the water content in the soil, for instance. But there are more and more high-tech solutions coming to the market, which allow us to measure much more efficiently. If you think of carbon credits, for instance, and I'm going to only touch upon the subject because I know this is one of those snowball discussions. But carbon credits, you can predict the amount of carbon offsetting by satellite, but you need to validate it on the ground. And that's often very costly. And one of the problems with carbon credits is that we're not paying the true price or the proper price for carbon credits, because it costs so much money to measure and validate. So ag tech is also necessary there. How can we come up with technologies that make the monitoring and evaluation more cost efficient so that we can set a price that is true and that the smallholders benefit also from the carbon credits? So that's one of the examples. I do think there's a lot of ag tech solutions out there, but again, the problem is financing. So there's a lot of funds mushrooming now in the climate story, but not a lot of funds focus on ag tech for regenerative agriculture. And I think that's a hole in the market. And actually, I think from the Catapult Group, there's this new fund that was created, Future Foodways. And Future Foodways is also working with us to really focus on ag tech for regenerative and really getting the funds and financing. And I think that's also very important to focus on, because a lot of the challenges we face in this shift comes from lack of technology.
And focusing on that, on measuring those impacts as well is so important. Just briefly, do you both want to mention some articles or books? I know both of you have mentioned a few resources already that you can recommend to our audience who wants to learn more.
Well, one of the I already mentioned in the chat is Kiss the Ground. I think that's a beautiful documentary for anyone to watch and to really get acquainted with what regenerative agriculture is. What I like about the documentary is that it's very much based on real facts and data. And it's not just inspirational, but also for the skeptics amongst us. It really, feeds that curiosity and also explains the history of agriculture, which I found fascinating. And even being in it now, there's a lot that I didn't know about how the world wars had an influence on how we use chemicals, for instance. It's just mind-blowing. So that one's one I definitely recommend. Another one is Life in Syntropy. There's a YouTube, I think it's about 15 minutes long. It's also beautiful because you see firsthand what an agroforest looks like. And Yeah, reNature has quite a few articles posted on our website as well about benefits of agroforestry. So have a look at that. And then there's a few podcasts as well from Koen van Seijen on investing in regenerative agriculture. So there's a few. I'll put them on the chats.
We can also send them out in the summary that everyone will get.
Okay, that's fine.
Alan, any resources?
Well, I think Damon Gamo's Regeneration 2040 is a great film, and if you want to be inspired by an individual, I think just his personal energy is something quite extraordinary. But I think that's a great film to watch, and that whole initiative. So it's 2040.com, I think, or Regeneration 2040.com, something like that. Is something that I would personally recommend on this topic.
I just want to remind everyone that the next seminar as well will touch or go deeply into agriculture. So I have a little bit of a surprise speaker at the end of the event that will tell you a little bit more about what will happen next time. So Thomas.
Very happy to see so many friends and hopefully new friends gathered together in this conversation. Thank you, Eva and Alan, for some great input, and also just the following the discussion is, wow, there's so much things happening. I think that's so positive moving forward. So basically, I'm a Norwegian who has now moved to Mauritius. And here I have found a lot of people, some are taking part in this call, that really wants to be part of action or creating statements. And we are just starting a journey, which we've named Regeneration Mauritius, where we hope to show the world how this transformation can be done, not on a solution basis, as you were discussing, but on a system level. And the way we're going to do that is try to invite everyone. So create an open platform for individuals, companies, for discussing, but also for creating action on the ground. And here we would love to sort of take the whole regenerative approach. To do that, we will of course need to learn a lot about how. So how do we do this? What does it look like? Who can teach us? Who can lead us? Who can we get inspiration from? And who wants to be part of this journey? So the second event, which will focus on regenerative agriculture, will use Mauritius as a case. So we're going to invite speakers, practitioners who are doing stuff on the ground, so on the how, and ask them to see, what could this mean for a country like Mauritius? Hopefully, by doing that, we will make it so concrete that it's easier for everyone to sort of adopt it to their own area. And hopefully also, it will lead us to create a bigger movement around this change. So the event will be on 18th of March, same time. And we're really open for input on who should we invite to speak. I will, a few of the comments today have come from people in Mauritius, so there's a big group here working on it already. And why Mauritius, and why have I moved there? And I think it's part of this discussion that we're having here is, what does it look like? And I believe, maybe coming from Norway, I believe small countries has an important role to play. I think, at least in theory, it should be easier to change systems in a smaller country than a big one. But I think we need to see what that change looks like. So that is, at least from my, why I moved to Mauritius and why I'm so engaged in this, is that I strongly believe that Mauritius can be that an example. So with that, I hope as many of you will attend the event. We will be joined by people from, I think, a lot of same countries as today. Soil Carbon from Australia will give an introduction, and I hope some of the people today also will be engaged in that. So looking forward to see you then.
Thank you so much. And for some of you, you already check the little box on the sign up for today that you want to be signed up for the next event as well. So if you did check that, then you will get that link. And we got a lot of questions today in the chat, and unfortunately, we didn't manage to go through them all. But stay in touch. You'll receive a summary on your email. And I just want to say thank you so much to Alan and Eva for today's talk. And thank you to all of you that joined us this morning from all over the world. And I hope to see you March 18th at 9 a.m. Central European Time.